Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Well, you are listening to Mortification of Spin. My name is Todd Pruitt. I'm the pastor at Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. We are a congregation of the Presbyterian Church in America, the only Presbyterian denomination that really matters. And I'm joined, as always, by my friend and co-host, Carl Trueman, who is a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania and world traveler and author, and lives a much more exciting life than my life. Carl, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Todd. And
I think on our last recording, I mentioned the fact that while you were recently in Europe for a few weeks, you sent me several pictures of you with famous people, and I just thought, Carl Trueman makes my life look so boring, and I've got to tell you that one picture that you sent me with a particularly famous person, a particularly consequential person, let's put it that way. I sent that to my youngest son, who's 25, who has read a lot about this person and is fascinated by him. And I knew when you sent me that picture, I've got to send this to Matthew. And Matthew, though he didn't use these words, he communicated to me very much how disappointed he was that I never meet people like that. And he kind of lamented my boring life compared to yours. Hey, and so I just want you to know.
You hang around backstage at Elton John concerts. You get to meet Elton John too, man.
I guess.
No, it was a unique moment for me, I have to say. And the gentleman concerned, when we met him, he kissed my wife's hand when we met, and he kissed it again when we left. So she is now a 100% total lifelong fan.
Since it's World Cup season, I'm just going to assume this was Lionel Messi or something.
It is interestingly, it is not an athlete.
That sort of league.
It is not an athlete, but a very interesting world figure. And it's not Elton John. Talking
of interesting world figures, maybe you should introduce our current guest, Todd, who himself is an interesting world figure.
Yeah. Well, our current guest is a returning guest. He was with us quite a while ago, and he's back with us. Nathaniel Gray Sutanto, who is a theology professor at Reformed Theological Seminary at their D.C. campus, and also an author. And his area of expertise, if I could call it that, is the theology of Herman Bavinck. He's written quite copiously on Bavinck, who anybody interested or who loves Reformed theology, of course, knows of Herman Bavinck and at least some of his contributions. Well, the latest book is a kind of a compendium or a reader of some of the more significant contributions that Bavinck made during his writing career and teaching career. It's called The Essential Herman Bavinck, a Reader and Commentary. And Gray Sutanto is our guest. Thank you so much for being here today. Appreciate you risking your reputation by appearing on a podcast with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. So the last few days I've been skipping around and reading various sections and really enjoying it, by the way, and very helped by the introductory essays that you wrote. Very helped by it. If you're like me and if you've worked your way, or at least attempted to work your way through the multi-volume dogmatics that Bavinck wrote, something like this could be very helpful for you because there's a section dedicated to the dogmatics, which will really give you a good overview as well as some helpful introductory material. But I was also really fascinated by the first section, in which you get into some of his earlier works, and we'll get there in a moment. But perhaps we ought to back up, and if you could just sort of tell our readers, first of all, who Bavinck was and why he matters, why we want to continue to read him today?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much again for that introduction and for the book as well. Yeah, Herman Bavinck was a right-hand man of sorts to Abraham Kuyper, but I think now we're appreciating his genius. He's not just a henchman to Kuyper. He's actually a systematizer of the Kuyperian tradition. He's a progenitor of what's been called the Neo-Calvinist tradition. And for a long time, I think we've associated the Neo-Calvinist tradition with a kind of Kuyperian transformationalist vision, precisely because I think we just didn't have translations of Bavinck, and we didn't have translations of much of Kuyper's theological work. And we didn't realize that actually Neo-Calvinism is very much tethered to the confessional, scholastic, Reform Orthodox tradition, and that Bavinck was trying to not only capture, but also transmit that scholastic, Reform Orthodox tradition for the modern age. So he's a great example of somebody engaging in what we now know as retrieval theology. He was trying to retrieve the Orthodox Reform program for the modern age, but at the same time, he was not a reprisonator. He was a critical receiver of that tradition, seeking to update it for a more pluralistic age, a more global age, an age that is much more conscious about the challenges of non-belief, not just challenges from Roman Catholic or Lutheran polemics, but now actually from thoroughgoing secular unbelief. And so I think we have here just a really wonderful example of Reformed theology that engages so many of the issues that we're engaged in now in a democratic, pluralist, and oftentimes secularizing society. So I think that's why he matters.
Yeah, and we see him, and I really saw this in your introductory section with some of his earlier writings, where he's really engaging with some of the newer philosophical movements that were going on in Western Europe at that time, and engaging a lot with science. I mean, in reading at least a section earlier in my life of his dogmatics, I saw him engaging with science, but not until I started reading through this did I appreciate, and when I read his little volume on worldview, did I appreciate how much he engaged with science. Now, why is a theologian in Western Europe in the 19th century keen to do that?
Yeah. So one of the things that Bavinck often emphasizes, same with Abraham Kuyper, is that what the Enlightenment has shown us, think of the tradition of someone like a René Descartes to Immanuel Kant, especially the rationalist stream of the Enlightenment, that basically said faith is to be privatized, and what is publicly called science or knowledge is only that which is empirically verifiable, which means that there is a bifurcation or a dualism of sorts between what could be known by private faith and what is scientific, publicly available knowledge out there. And religion, theology might be good for your private lives, but it's not good for the university, for scholarship, for public proclamation and publicly available knowledge. And Bavinck basically said, this is a real challenge for us to overcome because for a long time in Christendom, we have assumed the relevance of theology for every area of life. But now it's an opportune time for us to communicate just why it is that theology is foundational for every area of life, including for the university. So he wanted to respond to, in 1876, there's this Higher Education Act in the Netherlands that basically said we're going to change and turn the theological department in every public university into a religious studies department. Why? Because religious studies is empirically verifiable. It's a study of humanity across history. It's a sociological study. It's a historical program. But theology is not all those things. It's not empirical. Hence, it doesn't belong in the university. Again, it's translated into religious studies. And Bavinck wanted to say, no, theology belongs in the university. So in the opening selection to Prolegomena that we selected in the reader, and part of the hard process of compiling a reader like this is just selecting which sections to include, is Bavinck's section called Theology as the Science of God, which is to say this is public knowledge. This is something that you could be critiqued about publicly. It's not just, you can't just make stuff up when you're doing theology. It's not just a private, personal matter for you, but it's a science just as much as the other humanities, the spiritual sciences, you would call it in the Dutch, Geestwetenschappen, right? So if that's the case, then it's an opportune time again for us to show how scientific theology is and why it belongs alongside the other sciences. So yeah, that's why.
Yeah.
One of the things I've become interested in recently, Gray, is the literature of the late 19th, early 20th century, partly because it seems to me that was a period in European history when there were tremendous shifts taking place in society and culture across the sort of the spectrum. And when you read somebody like Thomas Mann, for example, you're reading somebody who is both chronicling and analysing the shifts that are taking place. Now, jump to the present, and I think we live at a time when many people today feel the same, that there are great shifts taking place in society. There are undercurrents that we can barely sense, let alone understand. Do you think that Bavinck offers a theological model to us today in that kind of context? Can we learn from seeing how he wrestled with the distinct problems of Europe in the late 19th, early 20th century to the kind of questions we're wrestling today? We just to sort of make it sort of relevant, I suppose, we see in the Christian world a kind of reaction among some at the moment to a kind of recovery of the tradition that's being coordinated with, say, a Christian nationalism, all kinds of problems there, of course, because, the whole idea of nation itself is not a fixed category. But do you think Bavinck offers us a better way of engaging with divine revelation and contemporary issues relative to the Christian tradition?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that question. And, this brings into view, I think, in context, why it is that Kuyper's and Bavinck's tradition were called the Neo-Calvinist tradition, as opposed to a Paleo-Calvinist tradition. And again, in America, we think of Neo-Calvinism, we just think triumphalist, even sometimes post-millennial Kuyperianism, which is so far from what Kuyper and Bavinck actually said. And in context, what they meant was Calvinism was tethered to a kind of Christendom model of the relationship between church and state, where the state is kind of construed as an institution of nature that anticipates and protects the sphere of grace. And so this is the responsibility of the state to uproot unbelief, diminish heresy, and so on, and to protect the gospel that is belonging to the area of the church. And so what happened was the National Church of the Netherlands, and I'm going to simplify a lot here, the National Church of the Netherlands was liberalizing for a long time before Bavinck was born. And because of that, the Orthodox Calvinists were actually sidelined by the National Church, the National Reformed Church. And that formed the secessionist movement that Bavinck's father was a part of. And he was born into that movement. What happened was, between 1844 to 1848, the Netherlands became a democratic society, which actually meant that the secessionist people could suddenly enter into public program once again. They were no longer persecuted or sidelined. They were now free to engage into public discourse and free to voice their representation in the public discourse. And so in that moment of moving from a, say, Christendom model of the relationship between state and church to a democratic representational model, a lot of Paleo-Calvinists actually said, this is not enough for us to just have a voice among other peers, our Catholic and non-believing peers. We want to go back to the Christendom model, but reinstate confessional Calvinism. But Kuyper and Bavinck actually argued Calvinism is a friend to the new democratic age. That Calvinism has distinct resources given our convictions about human depravity, about this era being an era of common grace rather than the time of God's judgment. God wants us to coexist with non-believers. And hence, we have to engage public life as one worldview among many, but we have Christian grounds to account for the plurality that we see before us. So it's a very creative vision in a new democratic age, but it's not an argument for a representational democracy that is akin to the French revolutionaries, for instance, or the Enlightenment folks, that Kuyper and Bavinck were really sensitive to say, we are Orthodox Calvinists. But Orthodox Calvinism does not demand social Christendom. Rather, what we need is Orthodox Calvinism for the sake of a pluralist age. And actually, the pluralist age recalls us back to the 2nd century. And so, alongside Bavinck's presentation of classical Reformed theology, you have, for instance, in The Woman in Contemporary Society, which is the first translation of ever in the English that we provided here, just a section of a chapter, 10 pages worth in this reader at the very end of it. We see Bavinck arguing for universal suffrage, for instance, women voting rights. And he changed his mind about that between 1918 to 1908, where he wrote The Christian Family. And he was for this idea that women just belong in the home and they don't belong in public roles whatsoever. He realized that that was a cultural stereotype and not a natural reality, for instance, just in the span of 10 years. So we see this critical reception of Reformed theology prompted by shifting conditions, but at the same time not motivated or foundationally grounded in those shifting conditions. So I think that's incredibly useful as a model for us, as you say, Carl.
As I read Kuyper, particularly on politics, it's interesting because you can take sections of Kuyper on politics and what society ought to be like, and he'll read very much like a lot of the kind of current, what we would call Christian nationalists, in the fact that he wants Christians to have a very clear, influential voice. He doesn't want the public square to be used to advance what is wicked or that sort of thing. How do we differentiate between kind of the neo-Calvinist political vision,
yeah,
and what's being promulgated by kind of these new Christian nationalists like Stephen Wolfe and others that we see today?
Yeah, thanks so much. As far as I can tell, Christian nationalists see no friend in Kuyper and Bavinck to the extent that they actually
not
read.
At all.
To the extent that they actually read Kuyper and Bavinck, right?
Right.
So, what I tell students is that all important distinction between de jure and de facto. These are Latin terms, and de jure just means by status, by right. De facto just means in actuality. And Kuyper was for this proclamation of Christian values for the public square so that the culture can de facto be more Christianized. And when you ask the question, was Kuyper a transformationalist, you got to ask the further question of transformational unto what? To what end? What kind of society was he envisioning? It was not theocracy. It was not the reestablishment of either an Erastian model or even Calvin's Geneva model. He was very explicit about that. He was actually arguing for a pluralist Christian society in a de facto sense, but not de jure. There is no establishmentarian principle whatsoever in Kuyper's writings on what it means to be a Christian nation or a Christian culture. But rather, he argues that if we want a transformation of society, it really depends on the work of the Spirit, and it depends on regeneration, right? And Bavinck was in lockstep with Kuyper on that. So Kuyper was not trying to reestablish Christianity. That would be Paleo-Calvinism. Rather, he was and he wasn't even trying to say that the institutional church should be involved in politics. It's the organic church in its activism and its proclamation that could do that. The church also has a key role in forming people under the Word of God. But it is not this kind of theonomic postmillennialism, nor is it a return to Christendom in the 16th, 17th centuries, which they've associated with, a violent and conflict-ridden society that actually brought about much more harm than good. They keep pointing to Servetus as, right. It wasn't Calvin's fault, it was Calvin's era's fault. And they argued that even within 16th, 17th centuries, there's diversity. The Netherlands was offering asylum and refuge for Baruch Spinoza and René Descartes, for instance. So there is toleration baked into Protestant theology within the Netherlands itself, even when it was an established nation, So just very, very different. It's hard to categorize. So if you ask what is the legacy of Kuyper and Bavinck now, well, it's in the removal of the clause Belgic Confession 36. We see that, one of the part of the legacy is that the removal of the clause about the civil magistrate, its responsibility to uproot heresy, unbelief, and so on. But it's also in Kuyper's and Bavinck's argument for the government's responsibility to keep out of the worldviews of the people and for the government to equally fund secular schools and Christian schools and Roman Catholic schools. And that's profound. And I don't know if that could be applied in America, but it's definitely not something that is to be identified with Christian nationalism.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Slightly different question, Gray. How would you characterize Bavinck's approach to tradition relative to theology? It seems to me one of the things that should distinguish, say, Reformed theology from broader evangelical theology is Reformed theology's respect for interaction with appropriation of the Christian tradition. What norms would you see Bavinck seeing as operative in that kind of context that we might find very helpful today as we talk about reception, appropriation of tradition, etc.?
Yeah, so I actually have an essay coming out on this, and the introductory chapter in the Reader gets into this a little bit as well. But the essay is on Principles of Reform Retrieval, Lessons from Herman Bavinck. It's been accepted and it's to be published in the Harvard Theological Review, Lord willing, next year. But it's already been accepted, so it's just about production process next. So, and there I try to argue that Bavinck makes a strong distinction between perennial principles and public or social implications and conditions. And one of the things he always says is that when you're doing a Christian dogmatics, when you need a scripture, tradition, and this third category of what he calls Christian consciousness. And Christian consciousness has to do with the fact that in his conviction, tradition is something that we need to respect, but Christian consciousness is formed by social location and context, and that creates a pluriformity to the visible church that isn't always reducible to the effects of the noetic consequences of sin. So some diversity is always going to take place across church history, even when we take away the noetic effects of sin. So certain contexts of social location will determine your intuitions about, as simple as how a church liturgy should be divvied up, what time of day we meet, simple things like norms of hospitality. All those things are good differences and not always, bad differences. So not all diversity is bad. Some diversity is inevitable. So he says in his Orthodoxy and Modernity, for instance, essay that we included in the Reader as well, some doctrines that are really important in our social consciousness now are hardly touched in the confessional tradition of the three forms of unity. One example is the Pactum Salutis, for instance. He says it's very common in ordination exams to ask questions about the Pactum because it's really important for us to affirm the Pactum Salutis. And yet, in our confessional writings, it's not really elaborated upon. It's maybe implied, but it's not really elaborated upon. So tradition is not reducible to what's written in the text. Other issues like the Belgic Confession 36, he says, we recognize that perhaps the reformers didn't take their reinvestigation of Scripture seriously enough on the freedom of conscience and where we are in the New Covenant, such that they were still applying theocratic principles from the Davidic monarchy to today. And we now recognize that that's an improper move, and we've learned quite a bit from our persecution of the independents and the Anabaptists, he says. So we've got to rethink those things. And so tradition is all important. It's a normed norm. Scripture is the norming norm. But this third element of Christian consciousness, I think, isn't a new reality. I think it's just merely bringing to the forefront what's always been there in the Reformed tradition. That, Dutch Protestantism has never been the same as Scottish Protestantism. And there's always been a recognition of pluriformity because we've denied a central hierarchy of the Roman Church. And I think so he's doing something new, but it's not introducing a new concept. He's just bringing into the forefront of our consciousness a reality that's always been there, which is that our social locations have provided a healthy diversity that shows the Catholicity of the Christian faith and why the Christian faith is a pliable faith, even as it is a tradition and anchored faith in the Scriptures and in the Spirit's illumination. Hopefully that answers your question, Carl.
I just one more question for me. Maybe I'm just too simple, but I still find the term worldview helpful, and that's why when I see Bavinck use it, I'm a little cheered, because I still do find that term helpful in dealing with. We have a lot of university students at our church, and I routinely have gatherings with them where we have a time of teaching, and I've found Bavinck's worldview writings, and particularly as he writes also about doctrine of creation, I found those two resources really helpful in teaching our university students, because unsurprisingly they want to know more about what do I say to the people who say this and that are so contrary to the Christian tradition, what we know, and all the regular categories, sexuality, transgenderism, all those types of things. But I have found Bavinck's categories in his writings on worldview and the way he wrote specifically about doctrine of creation really helpful in kind of giving good handles to college students today. What is, encourage those pastors and teachers out there, if you can, to turn to him on some of those things, particularly as they're communicating to the young people in their church.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you're tepid about the worldview, because I heard when I was a student at Westminster Seminary, Carl regularly polemicized against worldview.
Oh, I know. I specifically brought that up just to take a punch at Carl, for sure.
Social imaginary.
Social imagination is fine.
Sure.
Let me put it this way. I think, Bavinck's 1908 text that we translated, Christian Worldview, is the Aristotelian work, Metaphysics, Nicomachean Ethics, to Plato's oeuvre. So if Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, 1898, is Plato, Bavinck's Christian Worldview is Aristotle. It's a more sensitive, granular systematization of what Kuyper wanted. And so Bavinck's understanding of worldview is not just about starting points. It's an inductive process. He actually argues that very few people could get a worldview.
Yeah.
And it's a corporate process. It's a multidisciplinary process. It's more like drawing a map than it is about putting on glasses. That's an analogy that we put in the editorial introduction to the Christian worldview. So if you think that worldview is kind of just an easily weaponizable thing in apologetics or something, I have a Christian worldview, you don't, so you don't know anything, and I know everything. That's not the kind of worldview thinking that you get in Bavinck. And it's just a shame that Bavinck's Christian worldview is probably the first primary source text on the topic, positive use of Christian worldview in Dutch Reformed Christian literature. And yet, for 100 years, it was never translated. And so we only got simplified permutations and watered-down receptions of Kuyper's Lectures on Calvinism, but not so much the Aristotelian systematizer that is Herman Bavinck's.
Yeah. Well, I commend our pastors out there to use it. It's very helpful. It's still so timely in terms of the categories it gives us. So it was good.
There's a selection of it in the reader.
Yeah.
There's a selection of it in the reader, and of course, the small book from Crossway is worth getting to, hopefully.
Yep, sure is. Yeah, good.
Well, as always, it's a pleasure to have had you on the program, Gray, and pleasure to talk about Bavinck, who remains, I think, one of the great resources for reform thinking in the present day. So want to thank our guest today, Gray Sutanto, who's a PhD, of course, from the University of Edinburgh, studied under, I think, James Eglinton, who was, of course, in the student group that my wife and I used to run at the Free Church of Scotland, Bonaccord in Aberdeen. So I've known James since before he became a respectable member of the community. But it's a great pleasure to have had Gray Sutanto on. He is currently Associate Professor of Systematic Theology at Reformed Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. RTS professors have been great friends of this program. We like to think that we're great friends of RTS. So wonderful to have you on. Want to commend the latest book to our listeners, The Essential Herman Bavinck, a reader and commentary, edited by Gail E. Dornbos and N. Gray Sutanto. It's published by Baker. We don't have any copies to give away at this time, but Baker have generously offered a discount to any listener who would like to purchase a copy. So if you go to our website, mortificationofspin.org, you will find a link there which will allow you to purchase this book with a 40% discount. And while you're there, if you feel led, please do make a donation. We are a listener-supported podcast. All now that remains for me is to thank you for joining us today and say we look forward to being with you next time.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.